Should I talk to you or talk to him? Okay.
Yeah, not bad at all. I mean,
What are you going to do with that?
we're redecorating, and and so I'm gonna. I think like a light will shine on it. I'm not sure it's gonna be from the top or the bottom. We're still working out. Gotta get the electrician in. They asked me to, say a few words, and I wasn't really sure what to say. This has been just a crazy sort of year and a half for me. 2 years ago, I was finishing up the book. I finished it around Thanksgiving of 2015, and I guess I've been asked if I knew that the book would take off the way it did, or people would respond. And I really had no idea. I thought I was just doing my usual thing, and just try to do the best job I can with each book. But I remember I gave the first 100 pages to my editor, an agent, and my wife, and they liked it, and they were like, "It's very good. It's sort of gooder than your other books." And so I sort of got the hint that I was doing something different, and then since I handed it in, it's just been such a crazy ride. And people ask, like, has your life changed with everything that happened? And I guess I would just say that I'm in a much better mood than usually. I usually wake up at 4 a.m. Previously just like stricken by horror and anxiety, and I sort of get up and I'm really in a good mood, and it's been that way for a few months now.
Well, and it has changed because you do things now like taking 2-day trips to Paris, which you did this week, right?
Yeah, I flew to Paris to do a TV show, and I don't usually do that. It's not really a feature of my life before this, so.
Before we chat, Colson's going to read a little bit. Page 285.
285, indeed.
There
And it's towards the end of the book. Cora has found her way to Indiana, to a black utopia, Valentine Farm. And they're self-sufficient from the white community down the road. And every Saturday they have music, they debate the issues of the day. And in this section, a conservative voice, sort of echoing Booker T. Washington, has given his idea of what's next for the black race. And now Lander, a more sort of progressive, visionary voice, is about to speak of what he sees as coming next. "My brother made some good points," Lander said. "We can't save everyone. But that doesn't mean we can't try. Sometimes a useful delusion is better than a useless truth. Here's one delusion, that we can escape slavery. We can't. Its scars will never fade. When you saw your mother sold off, your father beaten, your sister abused by some boss or master, did you ever think that you'd sit here today without chains, without the yoke, among a new family? Everything you ever knew told you that freedom was a trick, yet here we are. Still we run, tracking by the good full moon to sanctuary. Valentine Farm, this place is a delusion. Who told you the Negro deserved a place of refuge? Who told you that you had that right? Every minute of your life's suffering has argued otherwise. By every fact of history, it can't exist. This place must be a delusion too, yet here we are. And America too is the delusion, the grandest one of all. The white race believes with all its heart that it is their right to take the land, to kill Indians, make war, enslave their brothers. This nation shouldn't exist if there's any justice in the world, for its foundations are murder, theft, and cruelty. Yet here we are. I'm supposed to answer Mingo's call for gradual progress, for closing our doors to those in need. I'm supposed to answer those who think this place is too close to the grievous influence of slavery, and that we should move west. I don't have an answer for you. I don't know what we should do. The word we. In some ways, the only thing we have in common is the color of our skin. Our ancestors came from all over the African continent. It's quite large. Brother Valentine has the maps of the world in his splendid library. You can look for yourself. They had different ways of subsistence, different customs, spoke 100 different languages. And that great mixture was brought to America in the holds of slave ships, to the north, to the south. Their sons and daughters picked tobacco, cultivated cotton, worked on the largest estates and the smallest farms. We are craftsmen and midwives and preachers and peddlers. Black hands built the White House, the seat of our nation's government. The word we. We're not one people, but many different people. How can one person speak for this great, beautiful race, which is not one race, but many, with a million desires and hopes and wishes for ourselves and our children? For we are Africans in America, something new in the history of the world, without models for what we will become. Color must suffice. It's brought us to this night, this discussion, and it'll take us into the future. All I truly know is that we rise and fall as one colored family living next door to one white family. We may not know our way through the forest, but we can pick each other up when we fall, and we will arrive together.
Can we start by talking about Cora? So Cora is a girl, I keep reading that she's 15 years old, but I don't think you ever said that in the book, right? Because part of the point that you make is that slaves didn't know their birthdays.
Yeah, in the same way you might have like a vacuum cleaner and know when you bought it, but not know the date of purchase. You know, slave masters didn't necessarily keep track of all their slaves' birthdays. And you can be sold when you're 3 or 4 or 10 and not have that connection to family. So in my mind, she's 16, 17, but of course she doesn't know, and I don't say in the book.
So why did you decide to narrate this book through not only a female, but a teenage girl?
I think that there are practical concerns. You know, I had a few meditative male narrators in a row, and so in the back of my head, there's a voice saying, don't do the same shit all the time, you know, mix it up. People are going to be onto you, to your game. But then, you know, when I was in college and read my first slave narratives, there's one by Harriet Jacobs, which is very famous and was a big inspiration. And she writes about how when a slave girl becomes a slave woman, she enters into a new, more terrible form of slavery. You're now subject to your master's desires if you weren't already. You're supposed to pump out babies because more babies is more slaves, and that's more money. And so it's just a different sort of hell than faced male slaves, and that seemed worthy of exploring. And then, you know, I tried to mix things up, and so I'd never had a mother-daughter dynamic before, and so it seemed worthy of, I guess, you know, trying.
So tell us about Cora, for those of us who haven't read the book.
She's 16 or 17, and she's a misfit on this plantation, Randall Plantation in Georgia. A lot of people have sort of commented on the brutality of the Georgia section. It's the book's not Gone with the Wind, you know, where a white lady is self-actualized against the backdrop of the Civil War. Before I started moving things around in terms of historical episodes, I wanted to get it right, and so I exposed the reader, you know, through Cora to the, you know, what I hope is an accurate picture of a plantation, which means a lot of terrible things befall her before she gets the courage to leave. Her mother is left a couple years before and escaped to the north, and so she's left to her own devices, a sort of misfit on the plantation. And I guess in coming up with her, I do a lot of outlining before I start, but I don't necessarily know the characters and how they walk and talk. And so there are 2 moments early where that became a template for how she would act throughout the book. When she stands up to a bully who's trying to take her garden away, and then when she protects a boy from being beaten. She's seen kids beaten before many times, and this time she steps up. And so
were there any moments when you found yourself thinking, I don't know what a young woman would think? Did you ever have to go to any women and say, help me understand how a girl would think about this, as opposed to
a
middle-aged guy?
I think you always have to get in a character, you know, no matter who it is, whether the character is very close to you or very far from you. And so I didn't ask anybody. I haven't gotten a lot of complaints. But I think it's just always hard, whether you know the person really well or not. And so I think that if it's difficult, that means you're probably putting in the work to make it sound real.
So a lot of people are reading this as history. Should they?
No, it says fiction on the cover. And definitely, once you get underground and there's a literal train, that's sort of like the tip-off that it's a novel. So, unfortunately, I have met people who are in their 40s and 50s who have read the book, and the book taught them that it's actually not a literal railroad. They've gone through most of their lives thinking that it's real. I've met people who thought it was not real, and then I've read the book and now think it's real. And that's not really my job. That's sort of I think fourth grade history teachers should really sort of step up a little more.
One of the things I thought about the whole time reading this book was, what I learned in school about slavery, having grown up in Georgia. I thought slaves existed in South Carolina, Mississippi, and Virginia. Seriously.
No, yeah, I mean.
And it just, I think all of us should question what we learned in school. What did you learn in school about slavery?
Well, I think I sort of remember like 10 minutes on slavery and then 40 minutes on Lincoln, and that was like it. And then in high school, like 10 minutes on segregation and then 40 minutes on Martin Luther King, and that was like it. And I think now maybe it's like 12 minutes slavery, 38 Lincoln, but no, we skip over it. Who wants to confront the reality of how this country came to be?
So at what point did you find yourself thinking more seriously about slavery and wanting to learn what it was?
Well, I think being in college, I wanted to be a writer. Taking a class on early African American fiction, and it was nonfiction and fiction, was important for me as a person and as a writer. To read people like Harriet Jacobs, who I hadn't heard of, in high school and before then. But then, I can't say that I was very well informed about slavery before I started doing research. I knew, I'm sort of well educated and knew the basic facts, but I think coming to the material as a grown-up, in my 40s, as opposed to like a kid watching Roots or a college reading slave narratives, I think I have a new sort of grown-up appreciation of the devastation of slavery, and I think reading the sort of primary documents, former slaves, looking back upon their lives.
Tell us how you did that research. Where did you have to go? What did you excavate?
I didn't really go anywhere. I don't like leaving the house. Actually, I was really surprised that so many people were out in the museum. Like, people leave their houses on Saturdays? Like, that's sort of news to me. So whatever research I can do from my house makes me very happy. And of course, if you
and what was that? What could you do from your house?
All the slave narratives, of course, digitized by different libraries. In the 1930s, the U.S. government, during the Great Depression, trying to get writers back to work, which seems crazy, had them interview former slaves, people who were in their 60s and 70s, who were kids at the time of the Civil War, to get their life histories before they died. And it's just so much. So there are hundreds and hundreds of these accounts. Some are 2 paragraphs, some are 10 pages. And there's so much stuff in there that would not go in a history book, but for a fiction writer, leads you down different creative avenues. I remember reading about a woman talking about how once a year they'd get wooden shoes. And I know that was an American thing. I thought that was like Holland or whatever. But who's the carpenter? Does just make chairs all year? And then he has this one big order from the plantation that tides them over. How long do they last? What kind of wood? And so, as a fiction writer, and not a historian, I'm just sort of sucking up all these little facts and nouns and verbs. Did they say wagon or buggy in 1850? Which again wouldn't be in a history book, but for me is great material.
What did you learn that surprised you?
And again, it's sort of obvious, but you don't necessarily think about it every day. But it's not just slave masters who are upholding the system or carpenters. It's the newspaper guy at the North Carolina, the Charlottesville Tribune, who helps slave masters write runaway slave ads. And I put a few of those in the book. He's upholding the system as well. He's part of the organization that sort of sucks every American into the terrible enterprise. And so really sort of stepping back and seeing just how insidious and deep the tentacles of the institution went.
Did you find yourself in an emotional churn doing this, or did you have that kind of writerly distance on what
Once
you
I started
were
writing,
learning?
definitely, but doing the research, and then there's one thing I'm gonna have to put Cora through terrible things, and the supporting cast, just to be realistic. I wanted to sort of, before I start fooling around, I wanted to testify for my sort of nameless ancestors who somehow survived. In many ways, like I shouldn't be here. It's just an accident that they weren't killed 170 years ago. And so wrestling with that was the hard part. Once I started writing, I felt very distanced. But then I got 100 pages in, and I was like, oh, I can watch 12 Years a Slave. I've been putting it off, but the book is far along, and I can watch the movie. And I could only watch an hour. I could put it on the page every day, but I couldn't even see actors do it. And I love horror movies. I'll watch Texas Chainsaw 4, The Quickening, or whatever. But I couldn't see, real human beings even acting out the anguish of slavery. And I haven't finished the movie since.
Did immersing yourself in this change your own sense of being Black?
I guess being ironic Gen Xer, when people say I hear my ancestors talking, I always thought that was really corny. I couldn't really embrace being part of a sacred lineage of Africans in America. But trying to just conceive of how you just keep your psychology together in the plantation hell, knowing that you can see your child beaten every day, taken away, raped, tortured in all these different ways. How do you keep a coherent psychology? And that sort of fed into how the slaves treat each other in Georgia. People have been surprised that not everyone's helping each other out. But if you've been, writing in 2015 what we know about trauma and what it does to you, they're incredibly damaged. And so you talked about getting into the head of a woman. I wasn't thinking so much about that, but someone who has seen so much devastation every day and knowing that next day you could be next and sort of wrestling with that.
Did you have to work against imposing this 21st century understanding of trauma and all of that on the story?
It felt very natural. Again, no matter what kind of character, whether it's like a zombie hunter in Zone 1 or a kid growing up in the 80s or a traumatized slave in this book, I'm just trying to figure out what's a logical human response that makes sense in these different territories, different settings. And so I think that pop culture plantation where there's like one Uncle Tom, but everyone is helping each other, doesn't make sense to me as like a human being. Perhaps that speaks ill of my view of human nature. And it doesn't seem to resonate with what we know about how damaged people go through their lives.
You've talked about this being the rare book for you that wasn't funny, wasn't ironic. Were you tempted at all to insert?
No, I mean, really, once I sort of signed on, I just knew that a certain way of dealing with people in the world was not going to fit here. And then, my previous book is about the World Series of Poker, but for me, it's just like a humor book, just like a weird, depressed, middle-aged guy, me, I guess, doing a lot of weird jokes. And so I felt like I had stuffed every kind of weird thing that occurred to me into that book, so I could actually have a book with no jokes. It seemed okay.
I was looking on your website the other day, and in the past 5 months, you've been, 30, 40 different events all over the world. You've been to China, you've been to France. You went to the Louisiana Festival in Copenhagen, where I noted on their website, they say you're Barack Obama's favorite author.
I'm not sure if that's true, but a lot of things get lost in translation when you...
What have you found that people in other countries want to know about this book or comprehend about it in a different way?
Well, if we know less, very little about the Underground Railroad, how it worked, they know even less. And so more people think it's actually real after they read the book there, but I can't do anything about that. But the book has traveled in a way my other books haven't traveled, and I wasn't thinking about that when I was writing it, but say in France and Poland, they would link the French and Polish resistance under the Nazis to the Underground Railroad workers, fighting against this oppressive system, smuggling people to safety, the risks and the hazards of that kind of enterprise. And I wasn't thinking about that when I was writing the book. And then I think it's about American slavery, but of course that dynamic between master and slave, if you want to call it the oppressors and the oppressed, or the dominators and the dominated, it's of course has driven so much of human civilization. So I've been surprised how different countries are grafting their own histories onto the book. I think they're surprised too. It's like, like, I don't know, I really related to Cora. She's like a 17-year-old black person. It was like, I guess we're people too, so.
Let's go back a moment. So your first published novel was The Intuitionist, and that was 1990.
99-ish, yeah.
And you dedicated it to your parents. Tell us a little about your parents.
Well, I mean, I think like a lot of parents, they want you to get a real job.
And this is in New York City, in Manhattan, right?
New York City. They work together, they own their own business, and definitely, my father was first generation college, wanted me to, go to economics, study economics in college, and become a doctor or a lawyer or something. And so when I said I wanted to work at the Village Voice, my first job after college, they're like, please don't. And then even when I sold my first book, they were like, don't quit your day job. And it became really real that I was a writer when it came out and they could hold it in their hands. But so I think that they're very confused, but also that I didn't want to go into business or whatever and get a real job. But they also said growing up that, you can do whatever you want. And this is America, and I think they meant you can do whatever you want in banking, but ever since I was a kid, there's like, we've struggled, our parents have struggled, and this is like the 70s, post-civil rights moment. You really can be anything you want in this country.
How was their experience of growing up black in this country different from yours?
Well, I mean, I think in the same way that I could never envision a black president, growing up, they couldn't envision the fact that there's someone who write a book about elevators and inspectors.
Which was The Intuitionist.
The Intuitionist, that he would want to, that he would have this notion of freedom that he could not get a real job, a sort of professional job, and just be a weirdo writer. When I have been traveling abroad and they want to know a lot about Trump and how we're feeling and et cetera.
What do you tell them?
I just say it's really terrible, but there's so much about what my grandparents and parents went through when they were trying to raise kids in the 40s and 50s. My parents trying to raise kids, black kids, in the 70s and 80s in a racist country.
Can you be a little more specific? I mean, about what your understanding of what they went through in those periods?
Being the first.
Yeah.
Going to college and applying for jobs, and because they went to NYU or Smith or Dartmouth, showing up and just being told, we actually don't hire colored people. Like, you went to Dartmouth, so we assumed that you were white, and we actually don't hire you. moving from colored fountains, the disappearance of colored-only signs. People of my generation, can't conceive of the sort of daily miseries, humiliations of growing up in a country that's more racist than our currently racist country. So we're always just talking about degrees. So I don't know.
I think a lot of younger people don't believe that it was more racist before. Do you?
It's hard to believe given what's going on. We have neo-Nazis marching in Virginia. But no, yes, things were worse. I don't think we can go back to different periods. You can fixate on so many different moments in our history. But I think in the last year we're definitely sliding back a little bit, or a lot. I think it's more accurate to say.
Let's go back to the plot of the book for a moment. So Cora travels to all of these different places along this railroad. She comes out never knowing what she's going to find in South Carolina and Indiana and Tennessee, in North Carolina. How many stops are there?
A few.
A few. And we were talking in the green room about the role of white people in this. There are some helpful, benevolent white people, but in my reading, most of them are compromised in some way. Most of them, when push comes to shove, are not going to come all the way through. What was your thinking about the rendering of white people in the book?
I didn't think about it like that. I just thought about being engaged in an incredibly dangerous enterprise, theft of property, in this case the property of human beings, wrestling with the repercussions of what you're doing, when you could be beaten, tarred and feathered, put in jail. And so, in the same way that the traumatized slaves in Georgia are hopefully multi-dimensional people, some heroes, some villains, so are the white characters. And it wasn't just white people in the South who were invested in upholding slavery, and some white abolitionists in the North who were dedicated to taking down the institution. It was people like Ethel, who's the wife of a station master in North Carolina, who actually doesn't care. She has her own sort of problems, is not up all night thinking about the slavery issue, is not that invested, and is really just trying to get through the day with her own set of problems. And so you want your characters to be well-rounded and three-dimensional, and that means that that applies to the black characters and the white characters.
Did you have historical resources for the white characters as well as for the black characters?
Well, no one in the book's actually based on anybody. Harriet Jacobs, who I mentioned, spent 7 years in an attic before she got passage out to the North, and I sort of pay homage to her in the North Carolina section in my book. But no, I drew from different black and white station masters and moved their details around depending on what I needed them to do in North Carolina or Tennessee.
Because of the topic of this book, you're called upon to talk about race all the time now. Did you talk about race as much before this book as you're summoned to do now?
Well, sometimes you write a book and no one actually gives a shit, and then sometimes you do and you get more invitations to write about things. But I'm not exactly the most, I'm not getting the telegrams every day from Black Central to pontificate on stuff. And so people ask me, what's next for Black Lives Matter? And I'm like, maybe you should ask Black Lives Matter. Or various weird things. It's been a long year and a half. And so basically, I'm not like a pundit. I don't want to appear on your dumb talk show to talk about authenticity or can white people write about black people in their books? You know,
Can they?
well, for me, the view is very simple, so that's why I find the question irritating. Because you can do whatever you want if you get away with it. You're supposed to use your empathy and imagination to write about the world, people who are not like you, people who are like you, right across race, class, and gender. That's your job as an artist. And also, when you screw it up, and people say, actually, the black mother in the book was kind of a mammy and it's kind of racist, take the hit and move on. Don't write articles about how PC culture is ruining blah, 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 you know. Just, I screwed up, I'll do better next time. You know, so there you go.
You teach writing.
I do, yes.
Right. And I read somewhere that you have told your students to write the story that scares you shitless. And that you were scared of writing this book.
I was. I did many years ago and put it off.
What scared you about this book?
Well, dealing with slavery and doing that sort of deep dive into history. I knew that when I had the idea when I was 30 that I wasn't a good enough writer to pull it off in a technical way. I knew that I was not a mature enough person to write about slavery. Just to look around my office, you know, would tell me that I'm not a person who can write a story about, you know, slavery when I was 30. And so I didn't want to screw it up. And I think, and when I teach, you know, I want the students to not just write about 18-year-olds from New Jersey, if you're an 18-year-old from New Jersey. A workshop is a laboratory of failure. You have a couple chances to write a story, screw up, write from a male point of view, a female point of view, write that science fiction story. If you only write from first-person narrators, use a third-person narrator. You can only get better by screwing it up, so screw it up. And so, but I guess with this, I knew I would screw it up, so I waited until I knew I could pull it off, I guess. So it goes against my advice.
I heard you say somewhere that you felt you didn't have the empathy to write it when you first had the idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think like many 30-year-olds, I didn't have it definitely in. I was, you know, sort of selfish and self-centered, and I think, hopefully, if you keep writing, you become a better writer, and hopefully, if you get older, you become a better person, a more empathetic person, and definitely being a parent has helped me in that area. For one thing, I couldn't get up at noon like I used to once I had kids. I had to get up a little earlier. So a lot of things changed.
How many kids do you have?
I have 2 children. My daughter is 13 and my son is 4.
And has your older child read this book?
Well, she was 11 when the book came out, and she's like, "Daddy, I'm going to read the book." Before that, she would ask things like, "Do you have a job? When I come home from work, why are you just lying in the dark all the time?" I'm like, "I'm working. This is what I do. I just lie in the dark." So she said she wanted to read it, and then I don't think she got very far because she stopped mentioning it. So I think it's it's a bit old for a 11-year-old. And, you know, perhaps one day she'll come to it, you know. But.
Do you talk to her about slavery?
Not about slavery. I mean, I asked her, have you had, your American history unit? And it seems like they've had 3 units on the Greeks, and, 1 unit on America in the 1800s. So, like I said, maybe it's 12 minutes now, not 10 minutes, so.
In July, The Guardian said that you were 32 pages into your new book. How many pages are you in now?
Well, you know, I say, do you have weird rituals? And my weird rituals I've done since my first book is write down how many pages I write every day. Not that I don't have to write every day, but and so in May I wrote 2 pages and I brought me up to 33. And then there's a gap of 6 months, and then last Saturday I started writing again, and I've written 10 pages in a week.
That's a lot.
So now I'm at 44, 43.
Is this a book that scares you?
It doesn't scare me. It has its technical challenges. I think before the election, I was all set to do like a fun crime novel. I was really excited. I was reading all this great stuff. And then after the election, I was like, now I've got to write about institutional slavery again. I got to do something to address our moment. So the subject matter is depressing. It's scary in terms of what has to happen to the characters, again, to be realistic. So it's scary in that way.
So you grew up going to private school in Manhattan, right? Where you were often the only, or at least one of the few.
One of the few, yeah.
Black kids who was there. How has that shaped your sense of the skin you walk around in?
I don't know, I mean, it seems sort of normal, I guess. I don't know. I mean, I guess I didn't know anything else, and so...
Well, I guess that's my question. Did it seem normal then? I mean, did you have to learn later that it wasn't normal?
I guess when I, got to college and, your roommate is from West Virginia, and he's like, I grew up in Nicholas County, or as we called it, Nicholas County. You realize that people are coming from a lot of different places, and the world's not just New York. It's not private school or public schools in New York, but the country is sort of bigger and vaster than you know.
You've lived your whole life in New York.
I did some time in other places.
In Cambridge, right?
And
Harvard,
San Francisco.
Right.
But I get a lot of sustenance from New York City. With this book, it took place in the South, and I was really depressed. I couldn't get New York into the book. And then I figured a way to get Ridgeway to New York. That made me happy.
Ridgeway is the slave catcher.
The slave catcher. But I'm lucky that I get to travel and go different places, but I can't really see living.
Did you go to the South in order to write this book?
Because I felt compelled to go into the field like a real writer. I took some plantation tours in Louisiana. So I flew down to New Orleans and then got a tour bus, and I was the only black person on the tour bus. And we're driving to the northern Louisiana, and the tour guide is saying, this is a river road where that would take cotton and sugar to New Orleans, and running a plantation wasn't just sitting on the porch drinking mint juleps. You had to keep track of the accounts, keep track of the workers, and that was sort of my indication that it was not going to be a necessarily historically accurate. But I went to two places: the Whitney Plantation, which is a museum devoted to the slave experience, and that's really great, and then to a place called the Oak Alley Plantation, where they shoot a lot of movies there. If you want to have an authentic antebellum wedding, you can get up in costumes and have a wedding, pretend you're like a slave master. On the website it says they have rooms you can stay, and it says if you want to break free from hotel chains, you can stay here. So it was really groan-inducing, but compared to actually doing the research about slavery, it's really nothing compared to the actual realities, the weird kitchification of the slave master's experience.
Had you spent much time in the South before that?
In Georgia a bit.
Did going down there and taking those tours, did it actually inform your book or your sensibility of the place?
Well, I think you get the sounds, you get the heat, you get the sounds of the flies, the humidity on your body. At the Whitney Plantation, again devoted to the slave experience, there's names of different slaves who've been at this one place. They're very French because it's Louisiana, and so I would just take the names, I would take the prices of people. Slaves cost something in 1795 and something different in 1830, and so again I just take my notebook and and get it all down.
Did it seem like a foreign country? I mean, one thing I've noticed about people who grew up, especially in the Northeast, in the big cities of the Northeast, when they go south, it's like going to France, right? It's this very alien territory, and they come back and they make jokes about it.
When I was younger, not so much anymore. I mean, I think, I remember in '91 going across country and I had dreadlocks, my first set of dreadlocks, and it was more rare than, and just being stared at, in some small town where you have to stop for gas, and it's like, could make the next town. But not so much anymore. I mean, people would say, was it weird, when the book came out, this book, was it weird going to the South where they had slaves? And it's like, there were slaves in New York. Frankly, most of the country, before you get to the West, had slaves. And so that history is, everywhere.
How do you see, to use a cliche, the legacy of slavery playing out today?
Well, I mean, slavery ended, and then the powers that be found different ways to deprive us of our rights through segregation, through separate but equal, through voter disenfranchisement, and then you get rid of one way of disenfranchising voters, and you find a different way through gerrymandering or closing voting locations in different parts of the state. The methods of control changed after the Civil War, and then they found new ways. So a lot of people, I guess, when it's about the violence in the book, I can't really compete with slave masters who were just up all night thinking up sadistic ways to keep their slaves in line and then passing that down to their kids and stuff like that. And there are a lot of people who spend a lot of time thinking up ways to keep us in our place. And we have legislation that closes one sort of way of doing it, and then people are up all night thinking of different ways. So,
what do you want people to take away from this book?
I really don't think about the audience or reader. With my first book, I thought my ideal reader was like a 16-year-old black kid who might read the book and think, oh, I can be a weirdo writer like this guy. And then it came out, and there are actually no 16-year-olds in the audience, white, black, or weird. And then I gain audiences, and I lose them. People came aboard, with my books with Sag Harbor. That brought me a new audience, a realistic coming-of-age story. Then I lost some with Zone 1. So I'm always just like...
That's the zombie book.
Yeah, so I'm always just like disappointing people. And so I don't think about what people are going to get from it. Hopefully I can fulfill my artistic ambition. And then it's very nice when people show up, like today.
So at what point in your life did you think, I'm going to be a writer? I don't mean like when you're 5, but really when you think, oh, this is going to work for me.
Well, I thought I wanted to write when I was like 10 or 11 and reading Marvel comics and Stephen King and wanted to make up stuff. It seemed like a cool job. But I think what made me a writer was like failing. I wrote a novel, I guess before The Intuitionist, and everyone hated it. And
where is that novel now?
It's in a box for my kids that says, if I'm dead and you have a gambling habit, you can sell it somewhere,
eBay.
So that's a little nest egg for them, a little gift. But I think, I got 25 rejections, and then I said to write another one. If I wanted to write, I was going to have to write another book, and maybe it'd be better than this one that everyone hated, and people might get it or they might not. And then after that one, I'd have to write another one, and then maybe one day I'd be published. So I think it was just sort of realizing that I was not become a lawyer or a veterinarian, but just
if
kind
you
of
had to pick one of those, which would it have been?
Sorry?
If you had to pick between lawyer or veterinarian, which one?
I don't like lawyers or animals, so it's sort of a tough one.
Ergo, writer.
Yeah. I'm going to speak my own experience with animals and lawyers.
So here you are, just one of the most acclaimed writers of your time. No getting around that. Is it what you imagined? Is it different from what you imagined?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think, well, it is very different, 'cause I couldn't imagine, what's happened with this book. And I don't know. I mean, like I was saying, I was in a really good mood. Like, I never thought, before this, my record was like 2 weeks. In like 88, I was in a good mood for 2 weeks in a row. And now it's been like a few months in a row.
I heard you say on Terry Gross about a year ago you were in a good mood. So this good mood has sustained itself.
Well, I didn't want to make people feel bad, but no, I've been in a good mood for a very long time, frankly.
We have a few reader questions. I think you've already answered this. What's the next book you're working on?
Yeah, it takes place in Florida in the 1960s, and I will go down to this place in Florida just to like see the houses. I mean, it's always important. I think it is good to. I think with John Henry Days and this book, I had an idea of what the landscape looked like, and then I write 200 pages and actually go and see what it looks like, and I make changes, and I will have to go to Florida at some point.
So which part of Florida? Florida is more than one place.
It's true.
You're going to keep that secret?
It's too early. I only have 40 pages. I can't really jinx it. So.
What does your writing process look like?
I guess some people write every day. For me, like I need like 9 months free, and 8 pages a week seems to be a nice, sensible way to do it. Maybe 1 on Monday, and then 3 on Wednesday, and I'll catch up Thursday, Friday, or Sunday. But it is such a daunting thing to write a book that if I write 8 pages a week, I feel like I'm getting ahead. I'm always like trying to figure out when something horrible will be done, whether it's like a kid's birthday party or a book. So 8 pages a week is a good accumulation. If I have a dentist appointment like at noon, I'm like, oh, I can't work, the whole day is shot. So it's not any set day, it's just like 4 or 5 days a week.
You write in a private space?
I like working at home. I've never been like a cafe writer, so, write a page, take a nap, write a page, weep, make a sandwich, alternate.
Here's a question you may not want to answer for the people who haven't read the book, but what happened to Cora in the end? Or where did you hope readers thought she was?
Well, I hope people understand her journey and why I leave her where I leave her. The fact is, the book, I don't say the year in the book, but in my mind it's 1850, sort of after the Fugitive Slave Act, but before the Civil War. She goes to San Francisco, wins a lottery, finds someone to love. She's still a black woman in America in 1850, a racist country. And so what is the place of freedom? There are gradations of it. There's being off the plantation. I guess there's always Canada. People say it's nice up there. But
it's very rare that I want a sequel for a book. I really wanted a sequel for this. Would you ever write that sequel?
No. I think, starting with Sag Harbor, which is a very personal book, the books have stayed with me longer, and so for like a year, I was like, I'll pick up the story of Benji 20 years later. And with Zone 1, I was like, I won't pick up the main character story, but other places in this apocalypse would be good to visit. And then with this book, I didn't want to know what happened to Cora in another setting, but I could, the last 30 pages, which I was writing in the middle 2 weeks of November, 2 years at this moment, they're like the best 30 pages I've done. I feel very proud of them, and I felt really connected to them, for like a year afterwards, just like, all right, Colson. And so my version of wanting to stay with the characters with this book was just rereading those last 30 pages and thinking that I had sort of done what I wanted to do.
Those last few pages really are beautiful. I cried. I suspect a lot of other people did, too. It took me, I didn't know where we were going. It might be characterized as hopeful. But that raises the whole question of do writers feel obligated to make endings hopeful? Do you feel pressure in that way?
No, not pressure. I mean, I think I've had enough stories with really ambiguous endings. This is really even more or less ambiguous than a lot of other things I've done. And so I sort of know where she is. And I think it is...
But you're not going to tell us?
Sorry?
You know where she is, but you're not going to tell us?
No, emotionally. And it is a place that is not Randall, and it is a place of hope, for me anyway. But your mileage may vary, I guess.
We have one more reader question here. Did you have your idea on an actual underground train, or did you base your idea on an actual underground train on any particular aspect of the Underground Railroad from childhood or your teenage years?
No, it's really, I came across a reference, again, like 17 years ago, and I remembered how when I was a kid, I thought it was a real train. And back then, I was like, my first couple of books have started from like what-if premises. So what if an elevator inspector had to solve a criminal case and become a detective? I don't have a lot of hobbies or interests, and so. And so what if the Underground Railroad was a real railroad? No characters, not slavery, not American history, no Cora, just like what if? And so, and there are different stations, some stations are really big, some stations are small, some are very ornate. So there's no one sort of station, I think, that's typical in the book. They're all sort of different.
Most of your books have some aspect of fabulism or fantasy.
A good percentage. I mean, I think I wanted to write from like reading X-Men and Spider-Man and Stephen King novels and Arthur C. Clarke and stuff like that.
And watching Twilight Zone.
And watching Twilight Zone, Rod Serling. I mean, in many ways, Cora just steps into a doorway, and there's a real train there, and that's like the Twilight Zone. You take a different turn, you're not in your own reality, and Underground Railroads are real. And so fantasy is a tool you use when it's appropriate. Realism is a tool that I use. I think you use the right protagonist, the right narrator, the right rhetorical tools for what you're trying to get across, and you figure them out, hopefully, before you start writing.
I found myself wondering what novel you might write, realistic novel, with a white male protagonist.
Would I do that?
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of competition.
But nobody would bring your perspective to it.
It's never occurred to me, Like, instead of writing about slavery, I could have written about upper middle class white people who feel a little sad sometimes. Again, there's a lot of competition for that. So, elevators, poker, slavery.
We're almost out of time here. I want to do a quick lightning round of
Sure.
questions. So,
One-word answer?
You can have a little
Okay.
more than that. But the theme of the whole Humanities Festival is belief. Right? Belief means many things. It can mean religious belief. You can answer however you want. Tell me one thing you believe about writing.
One thing I believe about writing is that you get better. Like, definitely moments when I was writing this book, I was like, 10 years ago I would have written this scene differently, or 5 years ago I couldn't have pulled this scene off in a way that seems more efficient. Again, hopefully you just keep doing something, you get better at it. And then you start going downhill at a certain point. But, I feel this could be the top, but definitely I've learned things from all these books, and hopefully you remember those when you start the next one.
Tell me one thing you believe about religion.
Seems to get people through the day. With baseball and stuff like that, and yoga.
Among those 3 offerings, which one gets you through the day?
I like to cook. I was, my son is 4, and he likes to watch me cook. And I was like, today we're doing deglazing. And I was deglazing this pot. I was making this chili. And I believe that, food is good. It's nice to provide food to your family. It's nice to figure out different recipes. Cumin, like, wow. It's like, it's really great. human, you know, so.
Tell me one thing you believe about poker.
One thing I believe about poker, well, I don't know, it's so weird writing that book, because I sort of did a crash course to learn how to play tournament poker so I could play in the World Series. And I felt like my mind was just expanding, week to week. I was playing all these tournaments, and I got to the World Series, and I was like, wow, I can just see things a different way. And then, it was the week after the tournament, I was like, it was like flowers for Algernon. I was like this poker genius, and then day by day, I was like, what do I do here? How do you deal? And so, I believe that poker is incredibly mysterious, and I penetrated the first level of knowledge, and there's 20 more levels of pure poker knowledge that I can aspire to perhaps learn. Do
you aspire to them?
Well, I'm really cheap, so gambling is not as central in my lifestyle. I've had a regular poker game for now 15 years, and we used to play once a month, and now we're sort of older and have kids and travel and teach, so now it's quarterly. But, when it was all writers. We started, we didn't talk about work at all. It was just no, we never talked about work. We just talked about poker. And now all we do is talk about our work and our allergies and our sciatica. And so it would be nice to get back to poker, I guess.
Okay, that brings me to my next one. I have just 3 more. Tell me one thing you believe about middle age.
It's so weird because I just got these teeth pulled. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon your body. But again, hopefully you become a better person as the years go by, and that makes up for it.
Tell me one thing you believe about race relations in this country.
Well, I think we're really a pretty dumb species. Let me go a little forward, let me go a little back, let me go a little forward. But if you don't believe that things will get better, what's the point of going on? I think, why does Cora leave? Because she has to have this vain belief, despite everything she knows, that there's a place of safety. In my zombie book, the protagonist has to believe, in all of the devastation of the world, everyone he loves is dead, that there is a place of safety. So you have to have that optimism, or else why do anything? So.
Last one, related to that. Tell me one thing you believe about the future of this country.
Well, Plan 9 from Outer Space opens with a medium named Creswell, who is a friend of Ed Wood, the director. And so it opens up with him saying, a lot of people are fascinated by the future because that's where we're all going to live one day.
On that note, Colson Whitehead, thank you.
Thanks.